and today I'm going to be talking to you about getting traffic from zero-click searches with language and SEO. And the theme of this talk is coffee, because I love coffee, and I feel like coffee is kind of an international language. Everywhere you go, people wake up and want to have something hot, and maybe with a little bit of caffeine, but you can kind of get coffee everywhere you go. So I think it's a good analogy for what we're talking about today. And in terms of SEO, it's just important to start by saying that Google cares about language a lot. And if you've been paying attention to the news, you'll know that Google has been making a lot of announcements and changes and publishing things that have to do with language and SEO. So this includes things like BERT and Albert, the Natural Language API, hreflang, Elmo. All of these things are kind of components of how Google is doing a better job at not just parsing language, but really understanding language and what it means. And I tend to believe that a lot of this focus on language and understanding is driven by mobile and mobile search and voice search, because with mobile, there's less screen real estate. And so Google has to try harder to get the query results looking right. Because on a big desktop screen, you kind of self-select what you want, and you click on it without even thinking about how easy or hard it is. But on a mobile phone, there's so much less screen real estate, and you usually want to click on one of the first couple of options. But if Google's done a bad job, it becomes more obvious. So I think that that's part of the reason that Google cares so much about language, and that I think it's driven by mobile phones. And same thing with language. With voice search, there's a lot more keywords that Google has to process because people don't just yell a query at their Google Assistant. They don't just yell, you know, coffee, hey Google coffee, or something like that. It's usually more words in the query. And so we know that as Google has gotten more advanced, they have started doing a better job of understanding things like word order, for instance, in language. And so in this example, we can see that even though we have the same two words as a phrase, when they're reversed, they mean totally different things to Google. So when we search for red stoplight, we get images of stoplights that you would see when you're driving. But when you search for stoplight red, it counts stoplight as a modifier of red, and it starts to show lipsticks and nail polishes and things like that. So it understands that we use these words, even though they're the same words, when they're in a different order, they might mean something different. And that's actually much more sophisticated than Google originally was when it first started way back in the day. But Google still either needs help or gets it wrong sometimes. And this happens a lot because words can have multiple meanings. In most languages, there are words that have more than one meaning. So in this search for jaguar, we're getting 3 pictures of an animal and 1 picture of a car. And so I think that Google will start to do more to kind of guess at what we really want based on things like search history. So if I had done a bunch of searches for different cars in the past 2 days, and I search for jaguar, the likelihood that I want pictures of cars is much higher than if I had been searching for animals a lot in the past couple of days. So there's room for improvement, and I think Google will get there soon. But just knowing that one word can have multiple meanings and one language can have multiple variations. So those multiple meanings might be specific to one variation. And so the example here is chips and chips, right? When I ask for chips in the United States, I'm asking for a bag of thin-cut crisps. And when I ask for chips in the UK, I'm asking for French fries. You know, so similar but different entirely things. And so as SEOs, we often will do things like create multiple pages for translations of content and then link them in hreflang, something like this. Or maybe we won't do that. Maybe we'll just rely on JavaScript and use one page and modify everything with JavaScript and hope for the best in terms of how Google is going to process that. But know that we're working hard and doing all of these things to help Google. And some people even believe that Google used hreflang tagging not only to help them understand when there were multiple variations of a page, but also as a way to help them machine learn the relationships of one language to another and how you would say one thing in one language versus the same thing in a different language. And that kind of makes sense as a really fast way for Google to get up to speed and improve their understanding of a lot of languages all at once. And they may have done this telling us it was for SEO, but knowing in their hearts that it also had a side benefit of them being able to learn languages more quickly. But there's no doubt about it that algorithms, and Google algorithms specifically, are language specific. And this is because language changes grammar and the way grammar works, and then it changes just the way words are composed. So if you think about something like this example where we go from English, drip coffee, to German, drip coffee, it's gone from 2 words to 3. And if we added some other modifier, it might go from 3 words in English to just 1 word, where German has kind of created a composite word that means all of these things, which happens a lot. So different languages will combine ideas that are sometimes expressed in 1 word into multiple words or vice versa. And so the algorithm has to be language specific. And beyond that, different languages are associated with different alphabets. And so people will just search differently. And I know that you may be sitting there going, oh my gosh, Cindy, of course we know this. But it's about to get more complicated really fast, so fear not. But let's think about knowing this, that algorithms are language specific, and that the language can change a search result. But then let's look at Google Analytics and the information that Google gives us about queries that come in for our site. What do we have at the bottom? We have queries, pages, countries, devices, search appearance, and dates. Why don't they tell us about language? If they're able to detect language, which we know they are, why are they leaving that out of the information that they give us? Because we know that many countries have multiple official languages. And so just because you're in one country does not mean that all of the queries from that country are going to be in the same language. And if you're from outside of the US, outside of the States, I know what you might be thinking, like, oh, how cute. Look, the American has figured out that this stuff is different outside of the US and it's not one language, one country. And I'll give you that, yes. Like there are people who struggle with this concept, but I think many SEOs do struggle with this concept that one country can have multiple languages. But as for me, I have lived outside of the United States and I've traveled quite extensively. And as a company, we have put a lot of effort into researching how language impacts SEO, because this is something that no one else is talking about. And so if you haven't already, you can read this deep dive into entity-first indexing. And I'll give you the synopsis is that entity-first indexing comes down to language. And I think that mobile-first crawling, mobile-first indexing has very much a correlation with understanding and language. And I would guess that this 5-post series is the most extensive and deep kinds of information you'll get about how language impacts SEO and how we kind of tested that, which you might also find interesting. But what you have to take away from this presentation is that language is important to your job as an SEO, and that's especially true if your business targets tourists or immigrants, if your website facilitates any kind of international business, if your website serves an international clientele, or if your business wants links. Because remember, just because you speak one language or your customers speak one language doesn't mean that the people that you can get links from necessarily speak that language or speak that language in exclusion of others. And one good way to improve your ability to get links, for instance, is to have translations of your content in multiple languages. And again, I think, you know, mobile is gonna factor into this. Mobile is really what's pushed this further and made this that much more important. So I want to take a moment and ask you. Normally, if I were doing this in person, I would ask this question and make people raise their hands. But just think to yourselves, on your phone, what language is your phone set to? Shouldn't be a hard question. And do you have different language settings on your Google search? Have you gone into advanced settings and changed the language there? And the answer for most people is no. Most people set their phone language and forget about it. And people are not changing it often, rarely. And even if you've set, let's say you're multilingual, you speak multiple languages, so you've gone into advanced settings, maybe in Google, and said, I speak these 5 languages or these 2 languages. Google is only taking the default language when it comes to the impact on SEO. And so what you're going to see in this presentation is that that phone language actually impacts the results that you're getting and the results that your customers are getting when they search. So let's just break this down. Let's start very simply, because there's a lot of confusion about the different things that tell you or give you hints about what language you're searching in. Now, at the top, we have the country version of Google. This used to be one of the core parts of how you would do international SEO. You would just say, oh, well, let's see how it ranks in the right country version of Google. But Google has actually consolidated, and they're trying very hard not to have different experiences for the different country versions of Google. So that is less of a factor. And then there's the query language. So in this case, I think this is Spanish. So we're searching in Spanish, but we're doing it from Google Germany. And that stuff like that happens all the time. The country version of Google doesn't necessarily match the query language. And the only way you can tell the search settings or the phone language settings that are impacting your search, it's not from either of those 2 things. It's actually the language of things like the top navigation in Google. That's how you know that in this case, even though I'm going to google.de for Germany and I'm searching in Spanish, the phone language of what I'm searching for here, or the search language, is in English, because this navigation is in English. And so these are kind of the 3 things that people really get confused and struggle with separating in terms of understanding where language comes into play into a search. But you really do need to actually take this on board and think about this, because one of the big things that's come out of the past couple of years is this idea of the topic layer. This was something that Google started talking about after mobile first indexing started rolling out. That there's the knowledge graph and the topic layer, and these 2 things are based on entities. Now, what's important about entities is that they're language agnostic. So the concept of an entity can be translated many different ways, but the entity is still the same. So for instance, here I'll usually give the example of mother. That you can translate mother into any different language, and it'll have different words that mean mother, but in every language, mother is related to father, is related to daughter and son and grandfather, all in the same ways. And so entities, the relationships stay the same regardless of what language you're speaking. And so if you think about how Google works with machine learning and things like this, they have much deeper ability to gain understanding and gain specific linguistic understanding if they can keep these entities the same and know that, you know, this relationship is consistent regardless of how the translation works. So this word may be translated into other languages, but it still means roughly the same thing with roughly the same relationships in every language. And that means that they can learn things about the world and about language and understanding all around the world much faster. So where they used to suffer and they were really good at English but not as good at other languages, they're using things like the href learning and this entity-based indexing and topic layer to get a better understanding of meanings of the words and the phrases that we use in all languages, kind of all at once. And so with things like this, you have to back up and say, well, how does Google do that? And the easy answer is they use tools like the Cloud Natural Language API, or they've taken cloud out of the name. the natural language API, to break down sentences. And they can do any language that is in the natural language API, which I think is up to either 11 or 23. And you can look for a current list, but they can break sentences in all of those languages down to get very specific meanings out of the sentence. So in this, you can see that they understand that Google is a noun, and it's headquartered, which is a confusing word, but that's a verb and it's past tense. So they can get really deep understanding and know how words in a sentence relate to each other, which one describes which. And so if you had just think back to the stoplight red example, you could know that a red stoplight is a noun, or a stoplight is a noun and red modifies that noun, but stoplight red, stoplight is modifying the word red, right? And with these arrows and these relationships, that's kind of how they know things like this. But they can also use the language API to identify entities in the sentence. And this is how they kind of get to that topic layer. As you can see in this example, they know that Google is not just a noun like it was in the last screen, but it's an organization. And there's a Wikipedia article about it. And Mountain View is a location, and there's a Wikipedia article about it. Sundar Pichai is a person, so on and so forth. And so they're tying these things back to not just what form of speech are they and what language are they in, but what do they represent, and how do we use these concepts or these entities in language. And so it's much more sophisticated than you might think. And so while it's a good idea to do things like use Serpstat to get the top competitors in a particular country for a particular keyword, there's actually another layer in there that is, what are the top competitors in this country for this keyword in this language? And that's because as part of your strategy, you need to know that the likelihood of knowledge graph or featured snippets changes based on mobile and desktop, but also based on language. So you can see in this data from SEMrush, they've come out and said the likelihood that you're going to get a knowledge graph if your language setting is English is 11.75 on desktop and 13.75 on mobile. But the likelihood that you're going to get a featured snippet on mobile, for instance, is much lower. And I asked them about that because that looks particularly low. I'm not sure about that number. But in general, knowing that, for instance, when you're searching in German, the likelihood of getting a knowledge graph or featured snippet on mobile or desktop is quite high, especially for knowledge graph. But that, for instance, in Italian, it's lower. So just knowing that as to say, how hard or easy is it going to be for me to get either a knowledge graph result or a featured snippet? Or how likely is it that knowledge graph is going to be pushing my result down? So even if I rank #1, there might be knowledge graph above me and I can't really affect that. So this is something like, it's a question that you should ask as you're starting any kind of strategy to know what the likelihood of succeeding actually is. But also know that translation happens in the search result based on the language setting. So in this example, what I've got here is I've got a phone where the language setting is set to Hindi, and I do that because it's easy to spot, but I'm searching in English. And so what you can see is, #1, they're translating the top nav. So like I said, that's how we know, other than maps, that's how we know that the phone language is Hindi. But then they're also translating some of the calls to action in the PPC results. And in the first Amazon result below, we're getting Amazon.com. And I think this search was actually from the US with Hindi. But they're asking us, do we want to translate this result into Hindi? That's what that Hindi at the end of the meta description is, since you want to translate this, this page into Hindi. But when we actually scroll down, you can see Amazon ranks at the top, and then there's Google Play, again, some calls to action in Hindi. But when we get to the knowledge graph, what you see is, even though we typed in Amazon with English characters or Latin characters, the knowledge graph is in Hindi. And this is because Google has enough understanding around what Amazon is to say, yeah, I know you search for Amazon in English, but your phone setting's in Hindi, so we think you want Hindi, so we're going to translate the knowledge graph for you to make it a better experience for you. And most people don't know that, but Google is trying really hard to do this for you. And you can see even at the bottom, it says that the phone language here is Hindi. So knowledge graph actually sometimes, if there's enough information in the knowledge graph, actually matches the phone language. And even that happens even if it conflicts with the query language. Like remember here, I typed Amazon in English, but it's going back to the entity understanding. And again, remember, if you have multiple languages set on your phone, they're only paying attention to that top one, the default language setting. So the takeaway here is that changing the language of a query is not enough to get a valid test result if you really care about what's ranking or what the search result looks like. And changing the country version of Google is not enough to get a valid test result. You have to actually pass more information, and really you need to see real results, because often, for instance, you would never know if you were looking at your analytics only that that knowledge graph was translated, or the calls to action are translated, or things look different in this language setting. You just wouldn't know without looking. And so my concern for the SEO community right now is that people are spending so much time in their analytics software looking at numbers and symbols for rich results. Oh, did we get a featured snippet? Do we have reviews? Stuff like that. We're so deep in that no one is bothering to look at real results anymore. And I get that that can be hard, but I do think it's important to look at real results to know what you're up against. And I found this quote from Matt Kobach that I think really says this perfectly. He says, "My issue with data is it makes us optimize for what's easiest to measure while ignoring what's difficult to measure." And I know that this stuff is so complex and difficult to measure. And, you know, one of the questions I get is, but how far do you go? And I know that it's hard, but I do think at least spot testing real results that pass all of the things that a real user would pass is very important to informing your decision. So let's look at a case study. In this case study, we're going to do something with local intent, and what we're going to do is we're going to set 3 people next to each other, and we're going to pretend that this screenshot has people with the exact same phone. It's just a different color. It's the exact same phone, 3 people sitting right next to each other, and the only difference is the language setting on the phone. The only difference, okay? And let's put them at Google Zurich because Google Zurich's a fun place to be, and also Zurich's a great example for this because in Switzerland they have 4 official languages. Now we're gonna leave Romansh off because that one's really small. We're just gonna focus on French, German, and Italian. And so these people, they're sitting there. One person has French language setting, one person has German language setting, one person has Italian language setting on their phone. Now, if you were doing SEO for this kind of a scenario, this is what you would do. You would set up your keywords and you would say, okay, we're in Zurich and we're going to do the German keywords in this group. And we're in Zurich and we're going to do the Italian keywords in this group. So that looks like that might. And then we're in France and we're going to do the French keywords in this group. It looks like I forgot to translate my keywords in these examples, but that's how you would normally do it, is you would put the French keywords in a group for French and the Italian keywords and so on and so forth. Or you might not do that. You might just choose Switzerland and hope for the best and put them all together. But what I want to show you is that the reality is that if you do the search for Switzerland from, or do the search for espresso from the Google Zurich offices with a language setting, what you'll see here is that we have, I think Italian is the first language setting, and we get a certain set of results based on Italian. We've got a map pack, we've got some Wikipedia. Here we've got kind of knowledge graph under the Wikipedia, images, espresso.it, people also searched for. But then let's switch it over and we'll click the button for German in this phone. And now we've got side by side espresso with German and espresso with Italian on the left. Now look at how different the results are. It's a different knowledge graph. The map pack is actually even slightly different. And the results below it. The knowledge graph shows different images. Espresso IT is missing. We have this video carousel that wasn't there before. So by just changing the language setting and doing nothing else, same phone, sitting in the same spot, we're getting different results, like a video carousel that wasn't there before. And it's also the same keyword. So what that means is if you're not tracking languages correctly, there could be things that are in the SERP that you don't even know about because you are segmenting your keywords and saying, I want to track my German keywords here and my Italian keywords here. So let's look at a new test. We're going to do German, French, and Italian, and we're going to search in the right language, right? Because espresso is kind of confusing because it's spelled the same in all of those languages. So let's do it right. Let's do it properly, and we'll spell coffee in German, coffee in French, and coffee in Italian. And when you do that, this is what the search results look like on mobile, again, from the exact same spot. So what I'll do is I'll highlight differences here. So they all start with maps. Only 2 of them have knowledge graph. Only 2 have a related carousel. Only 2 have search by image. Only 2 have people also ask. All 3 have Wikipedia, but it's in a different spot. Only German has interesting finds. They all have related searches at the bottom. But when you put it all together, this is how different these results look like. So it is quite different when you're standing in the same spot. And you can see, like, Zurich.com is the only site that shows up more than once. In fact, when you omit things like Wikipedia, those sites that actually rank are quite different just based on the keyword, even though we're just searching for coffee from the same spot. And look at Cafe CH in Italian is killing it. And so if you are searching with your settings for Zurich and Italian, and you throw in your keywords for coffee, you think, oh, wow, we're doing great. But you don't realize that people who are multilingual might search for cafe spelled the Italian way, or might search for it with another keyword in the different language setting. So it can be a bit overwhelming to say, oh, wow, just changing one keyword that means the same thing can change these results quite a bit. But maybe you're saying, okay, Cindy, we know that. It's 3 different keywords. Even though it means the same thing, it's 3 different keywords. Duh. Fine. Let's try another test. Let's look at it and say, okay, Google, we block out what Google is taking. That's what Google is taking. But here's what you have left in these 3 keywords. And from a strategic perspective, what you can see is if you're not Cafe CH in Italian, there's only really 4 or 5 potential rankings that you can get. And that's tough. So let's look at this with a new test. Same 3 phones, same people sitting together. But what we're going to do is we're going to search with the German spelling of coffee, and we're going to search German spelling of coffee in German, French, and Italian language settings. Now, what you can see immediately from the color coding here is that the same keyword still gets different results based only on the language settings. So you can see at the top we have maps, and in German we have knowledge graph, Wikipedia, interesting finds, people also ask, search by image, and related searches. But in French we have a lot less of that googly stuff. And in Italian too, we have a little bit less of that googly stuff. But then look and see that the websites that you're getting are also different. And when Google takes its cut, what you can see is that the competition in Germany for the German keyword is much higher. And if you're searching, if you think about people who live in Zurich and search interchangeably between German and French, but they only can have one language setting at a time, you might have more opportunity than you realize if you're not tracking your keywords properly. If you're segmenting them, you might not know about all of this great opportunity to rank in French and Italian. So here's the same test, but spelling coffee in French and with German, French, and Italian language settings. You can see again, we have maps in all three, but then from there on out, it gets pretty different. We do have Wikipedia in German and French, but still in Italian, of course, Zurich.com is doing well. And this is what it looks like when we block out what Google has taken, the googly results. And so again, even when we're searching in French, but doing it with a German language setting, Google is taking more real estate than they are in French and Italian. In the next test, oh, and in this one, we can see there's only one site that shows up in all language settings, and it's Zurich.com. So if you were thinking that, you know, based on rankings that you're getting from whatever ranking tool you're using, that tracking things only by country is enough, that's actually no phone passes only country, and no device really passes only country. They all pass the location and the language settings, so you're not actually getting a realistic, you're not sending Google a realistic query to get a realistic result, but also you're probably not getting all of the information about the opportunities for you to, you know, take a ranking up and get into the top positions. So last one is cafe spelled the Italian way with French and German and Italian language settings. Again, we have maps across the top, but we only have a knowledge graph and interesting finds in German. German's just really tough. Google puts a lot of inclusions in German. We get search by image in French and Italian, and we only have Wikipedia in Italian here, which is interesting. So Wikipedia is off the grid in this one, if you're frustrated by Wikipedia always ranking. And then here's what it looks like again when we take the Google results out. So Cafe CH, really doing great in Italian again, but also showing up in French. MECH is only showing up in French and German, but not showing up in Italian at all. So again, my point is, and hopefully I haven't belabored it too much, the language setting, when everything else is held constant, can absolutely change the results quite drastically, and also can change the amount of opportunity there is based on what kind of zero search or zero click results, what Google is taking and making unavailable by putting their own stuff. So my point is that when you set up your keyword tracking, you need to do it like this, where you're kind of mixing the language settings with the keyword, the query language of the keywords, and you need to put things together and track them, because people aren't searching, they're not changing their language setting, even though they speak multiple languages and search in multiple languages. They're not changing their language settings when they do that. So we'll often, in some locations like Switzerland, have mismatched language settings and query languages. So you have to do it like this and not like this one at a time. You can't have the separate groups for each location and language setting, or you won't get all of the information that you really need for a realistic tracking of what people's search behavior and what people's search result looks like. And so the point is that you should include all your keywords in all your country and language settings. And for each country and language combo, you would set it up in SEMrush or whichever tool you're using. You want to have the setting for the location and the language. You need to have different ones. So you have to have Switzerland French, Switzerland German, Switzerland Italian, but then your keyword list should include all of those, because those are the potential language settings that people are using, but it's not, that doesn't limit the potential query languages that they're using, because they're likely switching languages, you know, all the time between one and the other. So like this, and if you want to do tests to see what a real query looks like, you can use the mobile Moxie tools, and this you can see we've put in the Zurich address, and we've passed the language into it. This is Italian again, and we can look at what does a real query look like. We can click around, click through. We can even click over in that map to say, okay, how far away, if we move, 2 miles away from Google Zurich, does that change? Or we can do the same queries or different queries in different languages and easily test from the location, what does that look like in a real result? So it's quite handy. And we can even, we archive these, save them. You can export them into Google Sheets if you need to modify things or just test it again. So like this one, you can see we have the same keywords repeated 3 times, but translated. And we test with the language setting, and we can just hit run test, and it's going to open that test really easily, make this kind of thing super easy for you. So what you need to know and what you need to kind of internalize is that zero-click searches are way up, and they're the things that are taking your traffic away, but they're often not reported in your analytics, and they're especially not reported if you're not actually setting up your analytics in the way that real people's search behavior matches with. Then they're totally invisible to you. So you have to think like a real user and understand that all of these things come into play when you're doing the search. Now, we can also look at a little bit of Rank Ranger data, and they'll say that just looking country by country, featured snippets changes. And so again, I think this is an important topic too to think about when you start going into this, looking at how likely is a zero-click result or a Google inclusion in this country, and then how likely is it between mobile and desktop, and how likely is it between the different languages. And then you kind of know how hard you're gonna have to fight to be seen around all of the Google inclusions. And so that's important too. So in this image, we'll see that sometimes featured snippets change even with the language setting, even though they're written in the same language. So I'm going to start this one over. We do best cup of coffee, and we have a Yeti image, and the best cup of coffee comes from foodandwine.com, and we're obviously searching in English. And if we go down, so we're searching in English from Switzerland. We'll just click German, and it's returning results in English, but this time it's got a La Cruste mug, and the top result is the spruce.com. So the featured snippet has changed only based on the language setting. The query setting, my location, did not change, but the winner of best coffee mug certainly did. So it's important to know this if you're chasing featured snippets as well, to know that you might think that you've got the featured snippet, but if you're in a place where multiple languages are spoken, you might only have the featured snippet for the language that you're tracking. So what do you do? Number one, don't rely exclusively on the numbers in your analytics because they're masking the impact of position 0 and Google inclusions in the SERP. That's all the stuff that I was blocking out with gray. Especially if you're leaning hard on things like Google Search Console, those things are just like they pretend they don't exist. And also the Search Console pretends language doesn't exist or impact searches when it absolutely does. That's why everything in Search Console is sampling and averages, right? They get away with a lot with that. Try to use tools that let you specify the search language to test in, or if you're using tools that don't let you specify, use things like the Mobile Moxie Serperator to do the tests where you actually pass the exact same information that a search device would. Because the tools that don't let you specify language are making assumptions, and they might make an assumption that this country has these 3 languages, but when they're doing the testing, you can't pass 3 languages. You can only pass 1 device language or 1 search language at a time. And then be aware that there are differences in the opportunities caused by the language settings, and so you can translate content. You can know whether or not it's valuable to translate content if you see an opportunity. So even if you don't target the multiple languages, you should be looking to see, is translating our content an easy opportunity to get more eyeballs on our search results? Because for instance, in Zurich, let's just pretend that the breakdown of the languages between French, German, and Italian is 30% each. if you're only targeting German and you're not targeting Italian and French, number one, we know German is where Google is taking the most traffic, but number two, we know that there are different opportunities, and we might have an easier time competing with 60% of the people, or competing for space on 60% of the people who live in Switzerland that have their phone setting to Italian and French, without actually doing that much other than translating the content. So it might just be an easy shortcut to get to the top of the search result in the country that you're competing for, and an easy way to get around some of Google's inclusions that are taking some of that are creating these zero-click scenarios. And last, do real spot checks. No matter what tool you're using, do real spot checks. You can't just check on your phone because your phone, you can't make it be somewhere else in the world. And so that's why we created our tools. You can set the location to anywhere in the world. You can set the language to anything, and you can search. You can even track it over time to see if it's changing. So there's a lot of value there, at least in spot checking. I'm not saying that you're going to get everything you need. Think of that as kind of an add-on, a sanity check, a reality check. Can we actually compete under these scenarios, and what do the different languages actually look like in the search results? And then life's short, enjoy your coffee. And if you want to try the Mobile Moxie tools that I showed in this deck, you can use the promo code Serpstat, and that gets you 30 days free. And I'd love your feedback. If you think we're missing something, tell us, because we want these tools to be useful for you. And that's it. I think we're open for questions. Are we open for questions? Is everyone still here?
Cindy, no questions so far, except questions which I've sent you regarding international SEO. And thanks for hosting this webinar, for conducting it for our audience. We'll be glad to see you again at our online events. Thank you.
Okay, are we going to end, or do you want me to go through some of the questions that came in earlier?
So I can see the question from the chat here. The person says that he has a client he is just starting to help with, and they have very niche B2B products. They have created a site with .com, EU, and multiple regional sites. The problem they are having is the .com is outranking the EU site for European users when the country-specific site isn't being used. The .com has higher authority. And the person asks, he knows that there is a lot to this question, but is there anything high level they can do to help the EU site outrank higher than the .com for the EU?
Yeah, this is tough. Yeah. There are settings in Search Console that sometimes allow you to influence this. The other thing is to make sure your hreflang tags are good. And in the worst case, if you can't get the EU site to outrank the .com, I would consider putting the EU content on the .com site. And if you wanted to keep both, if legally you have to, for instance, keep both sites live, you can use hreflang and canonical tags to kind of pass the SEO value where you want to go. Because it does risk a duplicate content issue, but in general, unless there are legal restrictions that require you to have the separate sites, I like having it all on one site. If you need to have it on the separate sites, then you might, on the .com, for instance, you can geodetect and have a modal. Google doesn't want you to geodetect and redirect automatically, but you can geodetect and have a modal that says, hey, it looks like you're coming from the EU. Do you want to see our EU site? And if they say yes, then you send them over there, and just make sure you get them to the exact same page that they were on. And from a user perspective, that's almost just as good. It takes one more click. But in terms of influencing the rankings, when the .com will usually have more links, often more content, and more history. So it can be hard to get EU sites to outrank them, but make sure that when you're testing and tracking rankings that you're doing it for country specific and with the languages that are actually spoken in that country, because that could influence which version of the site ranks, especially if you have different languages on the two different sites.
I see. Okay, we have one more question. What difference do you see between languages and countries, like French in Europe, Canadian French, or even English and American English, if any? So,
yeah, they're just in terms of SEO, you do need to kind of adapt and have local translators write your content. So, for instance, you wouldn't necessarily want to have a person from France writing French Canadian content if you could avoid it. But in some cases, the languages are close enough that you don't have to do that. So for instance, American English versus British English, there are cases where it's different, but they're not as nuanced. And so you can often have the same person write, but maybe adapt the English content for both US and UK. But for instance, Portuguese is more significantly different between Brazil and Portugal. And so you might need a local person to help with that, or at least someone who just really knows the differences between how the language is spoken in those two locations.
I see. Okay, so we have here only not the question, but the impression from Ben, who says that it's a great presentation, and he thanks you for all the information you provided. So thank you very much, Cindy. And if I guess no more questions by now, but if we have any, I will send them to you by email, and we may reply to our attendees online then next time via Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms. Okay, thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you very much. Bye.